The following is a presentation of the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
From the birthplace of modern winemaking, Sonoma, California, welcome to the Winemakers. Local experts Sam Couturi, Bart Hansen, and Brian Casey, along with host John Myers, invite you to listen in as they discuss all facets of winemaking. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and let's hear what the guys have to say this week.
Nice pour.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Winemakers. John Myers here as your host, and Brian Casey and Bart Hansen with us, and Larry Brooks, who asked that he be introduced as consulting winemaker. But, man, you've got a long history, and it's going to be really interesting to get into it, Larry. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I think I just did my 44th California vintage this year. Larry? Yeah, I would have been 45, except
Looking good,
I missed 15. I've only missed one vintage since I started.
So this show came about because a friend of the pod, Mike Cox.
Oh yeah.
Mike had sent a message and asked if we'd ever met, and I said no, but I was familiar who you were and all of your time spent in the business. And he said that you were writing a book.
Yeah, I started when I left Tolosa in 15. They gave me a year's severance, a full year's salary, a severance, which was quite generous of them. And my wife had been bugging me for years about writing a book. She wanted me to write a self-help philosophical work because she thinks that's what she's interested in, and so that's what she wanted me to write. But the only thing I thought I was qualified to write about was the craft of winemaking, wine growing. And I also have a beginning, probably about 10 years or so ago, I got deeply involved in sensory evaluation as a science, the science of tasting. So the first third of the book is focused around technically how do you taste? How do you become a professional or expert taster?
Where did you pull that information from, or is it just your own, not related to like when people are taking WSET?
Yeah, I'd always, if you're a winemaker, you're tasting constantly. My philosophy had always been in making reserves that you taste every single barrel, you do a true barrel select. And so a huge volume of tasting is involved. And I've also, in some projects, acted as, I guess what you would call a negociant, where you're literally tasting hundreds and hundreds of wines a week and picking out the best and doing blends and stuff like that. So tasting was a big part of like any winemaker, a big part of my daily practice. And the head of the Cal Poly's Vit and Enology program approached me in like 13 or 14, I don't remember, about 10 years ago. And they had someone set to teach the sensory evaluation class, and then the guy couldn't get a visa. He was an Argentinian, I think. He's now a professor there. And so they were in the lurch, and she said, do you have the time and interest in teaching this course? And I said, as long as I can develop my own syllabus and teach it in my own way. She said, you can do whatever you want as long as you teach this course. And do you know who Alexander Schmidt is? He's a French guy. He started as a perfumer, and then
what's a perfumer?
He's a professional perfumer. He creates perfumes. There's a perfume school in Paris, and one in Grasse as
Brian's,
well.
Totally interested. No, I just never heard of that job. I know that sometimes
it's a job. It's one of the hardest crafts in the world to learn. It's harder to get into that than to get into Princeton, to get in that Paris perfume school.
Wow.
Yeah. And you have to apparently start when you're like a teenager to really become good at it. It's of the flavor arts, perfumer is the highest level.
Well, it's weird because it's not based on taste; it's based strictly on aroma.
So's tasting. It's all aroma.
Like Hardy Wallace. Huh. He's into it.
Perfuming's been my hobby for more than 20 years. I make perfumes at home. I've spent tens of thousands of dollars on ingredients. It's a ridiculous hobby, but it's a good one for a winemaker. It really sharpens your sense of taste.
And I'm sorry, we're going to go down this little rabbit hole for a second, but where do you get the base? Because we use alcohol. I use highly distilled wine spirits, like 98 proof white brandy is what I use as the base. Right. But I use mostly natural oils and essences. I use some synthetic aldehydes and stuff. But the old, pre-World War II, it was almost all natural substances. I'm very interested in those kind of older forms of perfume.
And now, what do you do with those?
Well, I make perfumes for fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And then give them to friends and family.
Yeah,
and...
I would make them for my sisters. I made my brother a cologne once. It's incredibly difficult and labor intensive. Like a professional perfumer might only make like 2 or 3 perfumes in a year.
And you never make large batches, obviously.
No, I make tiny batches. The ingredients are insanely expensive. A little 10 mil of rose oil could be a couple $100. It's more expensive than gold.
And so
the finest ingredients.
When you need your neutral grape spirit, do you call Ciotti and say, hey, I need some samples?
Exactly, because they sell it in 55-gallon drums. And you could, there's 2 big producers, Vidal and one other. I use Vidal.
Yeah.
It's pretty pleasant actually.
Yeah.
As a base. And it was the traditional base in France. You can't use it anymore because of the tax. There's a lot of tax on grape-based brandies in France, so they don't use. But that was before those taxes were. Was the preferred base for making perfumes. Was
okay,
brandy.
and then the real difference between tasting like a somm would be trained to taste and a winemaker would be. You're in a very different stage of the wine, right? Because I still sit in sometimes on those, the little blending things or when people pull barrel samples. Right. And it's very different from when you've had a finished wine that has been in barrel a year and then in bottle for 14 months or whatever. Tasting stuff right out of barrel is a really different experience.
It is. It's much more difficult to taste young wines. They're more abrasive, you might say. They're not in a finished state. They're raw, as it were.
You have to be able to look through things at times.
Yeah, and you have to be able. And they're also in a very strong dynamic, which I learned when I was doing negociant type winemaking with Chardonnay. And I remember it was a project I was working on with Steve Dooley. It was called Echelon, and we were both making wines and buying wines, and we'd made more wines than we needed. We were going to sell, I think we had 70,000 gallons we wanted to sell. And we had this tank that we both agreed that was our least favorite, and we decided we were going to sell that. But just to make sure, at that time, Enologics, do you know Enologics?
Enologics, sure.
Yeah. So Leo at that time was offering a Chardonnay analysis. He doesn't anymore, I don't believe. He couldn't.
Leo McCloskey?
Leo's been on the show before.
Okay.
Yeah, he couldn't make any money selling Chardonnay analysis, so he only does red wine analysis now. But at that time, he offered a Chardonnay quality analysis. So just to back ourselves up, we sent all of the wines. I think we had 8 or 9 big batches that we'd made, and had him analyze it. And the one that Steve and I had agreed was our least favorite and we were going to bulk out had the most flavor in it. It was just masked at that time. And between the two of us at that time, we probably had close to 50 years of Chardonnay making experience between us, and had tasted thousands and thousands of Chardonnays, and we still got it wrong. It was a real eye-opening experience about how quickly, especially white wines, can change, and you can't trust anyone tasting. You have to just kind of trust the grape source, your own techniques, and taste it regularly until it shows itself. And it can be really late in the wine's process. I've made Chardonnays that I didn't really know what I had till a year after I'd bottled it.
Right.
Where I just thought, it's not that good. And then
weird.
So I just want to interrupt for 1 second. Steve, Larry, when we talked about this, you said that you were going to bring a couple bottles of Chardonnay because I want to make sure we acknowledge what we're tasting. And what you said to me was, I'll probably bring a couple Chardonnays I've made. I don't think any other wine illustrates the winemaker's intention more than Chardonnay.
Yeah, because there's so little there in the grape. It's all the flavors of winemaking, more or less. It's a good way to think about it.
Right.
Whereas red wines are the flavor of the vineyard, and the quality of red wine is all in the vineyard. Your job as a winemaker is just make sure you don't screw it up.
Right.
And you can just execute the most classic 200-year-old basic French winemaking model on great grapes, and you'll get great wine. With Chardonnay, you can't do that. You've really got to make the wine. You've got to be able to use the correct yeast. The vineyard source is incredibly important as well.
And you say that more so than other white wines too?
Yeah, because Chardonnay is so neutral, basically. So all the nuance of how you get the little bit of flavors there in balance. Balancing the oak is particularly difficult, and something that actually, when I was consulting with Enologics for a couple of years and working with Saintsbury, when Byron Kasugi was at Saintsbury, we kind of figured out how to integrate oak and into Chardonnay, and it's something that they've been doing in Burgundy forever. We could have just, been smart and like gone back to what most white Burgundy producers were doing, which is that after the barrel aging, after a year or so in barrel, you move it with the lees out into a neutral container, and then it's got to sit there for another 6 or 8 months.
A neutral container like
either stainless steel or it could be lined concrete, glass, anything.
Right.
It's got to be oxygen free, anaerobic, and that way you retain the fruit character, but the oak just melds. It's like magic, it won't happen if you leave it in the barrel. It just keeps getting oakier and drying out, and the fruit diminishes. But when it sits there on the yeast after the barrel aging, something happens. Nobody knows what it is,
right.
But you get this integration. You get this broadening of the mid palate. That's not structural. I don't even know how to describe it, but it just becomes richer and richer through the mid palate.
And not stirring, because you're trying to keep
You want to stir it a little bit. You want probably on about a 6 or 8 week basis. What you can, it's same when you're making like this, the second wine, the Bien Nacido, that's largely stainless, fermented and aged. And whenever you've got a wine in an anaerobic condition, you got to like stir it and taste it on a 4 to 8 week. You just taste it regularly, and as soon as you see the fruit start to diminish a little, it means that the reduced sulfur is coming up, is what it means, and you got to lift the lees up and make sure it stays. You just get a teeny bit of oxygen in there to balance it out. Yeah. Things like that. So the nuances of technique, you can't make I don't believe you can make a delicious barrel fermented Chardonnay without taking it into that second year of aging. So it's very, very expensive, and
that's the first time I've ever heard anyone say that.
The first guy to do it.
I mean, I'm not a winemaker, but but it's interesting that I've never.
It's standard practice in Burgundy. It's like how all their white Burgundies are made.
So it's really interesting. I share space with winemaker Jamie Kutch, and that's exactly what Jamie does. Is he keeps it in a barrel and then pulls it out at some point when he can, and keeps it in tank and topped up tank. And he's actually, for what he's trying to accomplish, he wants to get a little reduction, and he feels like that's where he gets it is in the tank.
Yeah,
and he always talks about there's times where it works and times where it doesn't.
Yeah,
chasing that dragon, so to speak, right?
Well, sure, and also because there's
a fine line on that reduction.
And there's more than 30 different reduced sulfur compounds in wine, so some of them can be good and some of them not so good, and the levels. It's a very complicated part of wine chemistry, and you're just doing it by taste. I mean, that's the only way you can make those decisions.
Do you think that they were doing that in Burgundy initially because they needed the barrels for the next harvest, and so they were moving it into a different vessel, and then just went, "Oh, this is."
I don't know. I never asked. When I left my role at Chalone as executive winemaker, again, I had to sign a non-compete agreement and not work for a year because they were convinced I was going somewhere else, and I wasn't. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll sign this. They gave me a bunch of money.
That always helps.
It does. It makes it much less painful. And so I had a lot of time on my hand, and I did a deep dive into Chardonnay techniques. They've always fascinated me. And I started talking to California winemakers. And do you know Remington Norman's book on Burgundy? Mm-hmm. Well, it's one of the few wine books where they go deeply into technique. And so I just read through that book and was, what are these guys doing with Chardonnay? And every single one of them was doing that technique I just described. And I thought, farmers are cheap and they're pragmatic. And I'm like, they're not going to have a wine taking up space in their cellar unless something really profound is happening during that period. And that's when, and then I actually, the first consulting job when I started working again after the year was up was with Heights, and they wanted me to help them with Chardonnay. And so I said, I want you to try this, and they wouldn't do it. It was really frustrating.
And what was their problem?
Well, like most people, when they hire a consultant, they want you to change one or two things. And I said, there's 50 things you have to change in your Chardonnay winemaking.
But we've always done it this way.
And they did a lot of it, but they wouldn't follow me all the way on this. And they wanted to bottle, and they wanted it out of the cellar and in the bottle. to make room for the next vintage. That's why very few people use this technique, because that tank could be used for the next vintage. It's quite expensive to do that. So that and then
not to mention managing empty barrels.
Right.
Once you've emptied them, right?
Yeah, but
so because you're on 18 months.
No, you're filling those up again.
You're right.
Yeah, but Byron at Sainsbury at that time, he'd been trying to make a higher reserve Chardonnay, and he'd been trying to do it with extra aging in the barrel. And I talked to him. I said, let's try this, and we did, and it really worked. And then almost all the clients, and with my own wines after that, if it was a full barrel fermented, and I like oak flavor. I just don't like it to stick out. Like this has like close to 50% new oak, and it doesn't read as oaky. And
well, it got so off track with mass-produced Chardonnay, buttery, oaky, heavy. Yeah. Back in what it was like the mid '80s and early '90s.
Well, that still continues to a degree, not as universal as it was.
But if anybody has a negative aspect of Chardonnay, that's probably where they get it. These are so different. Beautiful wines. And I'm doing an A/B test, by the way, just between the two.
Well, very different vineyards, and I use a very different technique on this one. This one is almost entirely stainless, fermented and aged. And in that case, because this one has virtually no oak.
Well, they're both very crisp.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Not heavy at all, which is nice.
Yeah. A few years back, it was actually, I think it was an English wine writer. I don't remember what it was. It was someone we were tasting at Tolosa together, and I made this style of wine when I was at Tolosa as well. And he says, I don't even like California Chardonnay. He said, but I like this wine. I said, good. It's like California Chardonnay was not the model for this wine. Right.
White Burgundy was.
Pretty much, though. White Burgundy latitude has a strong flavor effect, and Burgundy is much higher latitude. You could actually make a more exact duplicate of White Burgundy in Oregon because its latitude is about the same as Burgundy, and there's very strong flavor even between like Central Coast Chardonnays like this and North Coast Chardonnays. You can taste the latitude differences. There's more honey and melon as you go further south.
So are we latitude equal to Bordeaux?
I'm not sure exactly. No, more like I think closer to it would be closer to southern France.
Yeah, no, I think
we're 38 degrees.
I think Washington State is considered to be. That's how they used to sell themselves, as being in line with Bordeaux. So
wow,
yeah,
okay,
yeah. I mean, Bordeaux's fairly north.
Yes, it is, but Bordeaux's maritime, so it has nothing to do with Washington State, which is a continental climate.
Right.
Yes.
Have you ever had Consgard wines?
Oh yeah. Even back when the judge was making them himself in the garage. When I lived in Napa. I lived in the Stonecrest neighborhood. I don't know if you know the neighborhoods in Napa. And Judge Consgard, John's father, lived at the top of the hill. And I remember when I first moved into that neighborhood, it was a very chummy little neighborhood, and he brought me a bottle of his Zinfandel. I remember thinking, oh Christ, homemade wine, but it was actually pretty good.
Yeah.
And I remember looking at the label and thinking, homemade wine labels even worse than homemade wine. And of course, John I got to know quite well. After I spent some time in Napa, and actually, Alex, John's son, and my son are close buddies.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, they're really good friends.
I bring it up because some of the California Chardonnays that I really like have this weird character where they seem to have richness but without weight. It's this, and I remember the one time it's the Judge Chardonnay that I tried. I don't know what vintage it was, but I compared it to a marshmallow, where a marshmallow like has all this space to it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't weigh anything, and it was just I don't know what they were doing to make the wine that way, but I was just curious if maybe it was something like you're talking about, where they were.
John's a really smart guy, and he's a really dedicated winemaker. So, and of course, you have to farm Chardonnay correctly too. You can't see any direct sunlight. That's a mistake a lot of people make. The grapes have to stay green to make this style of wine, green in color, especially for it to age. Like this color, my this one's like 6 years old now. It's entering its prime. At 10 years from now, it'll still have the same color. I mean, this will not darken because there's none of the carotene pigments that are in the skin of a sun-exposed Chardonnay's got carotene pigments, and that's what causes it to brown in the glass and for the flavor to decay. That's why most California Chardonnays see too much sun in my, and it's a struggle because if you protect them from the sun, they're then very vulnerable to powdery mildew and other rots. Right. So it's a real.
So it depends on the region you're growing.
You got to do your work in the vineyard too, and it's not easy or obvious how to do that in many vineyards, coastal vineyards.
How did you do? What brought you to wine?
I loved wine. I started drinking wine when I was about 16 or 17. I would like buy $1 a bottle Riesling in New York City. I lived in New Jersey. We'd go down to the shore and drink Riesling and smoke bad pot. And, it was I just loved wine. And then I discovered sparkling wine. A friend of mine started working in a wine shop. And then I came out to California to do graduate school. I was studying plant science and discovered California wine.
And was that at Davis?
Yeah, I got a master's degree at Davis in plant pathology is what I eventually got my master's in, plant diseases. And wine was just a hobby, and I spent like half my paycheck on it every week. I was a cork dork,
Yeah.
And
so when you say that, were you making wine at home, you mean?
No, never. I made beer at home. I thought you had to be Italian to make wine, or your family had to do it. I mean, I had a very romantic view of it. Yeah. And then I went to a dinner party in Marin in the late 70s, and I was introduced to the two partners who founded Acacia, and we really hit it off, actually through a mutual love of Riesling. We talked about Riesling and motorcycles all night. Mike Richmond, he's still my good friend. I'm actually going to see him this weekend. And at the end of that evening, they said, hey, we're starting a winery. Do you want to work for us? And I was like, oh, sure. Like bullshit you hear at dinner parties, right?
Right.
And I remember saying to him, well, what would I do, you know? Because I didn't know how to make wine. I just knew how to drink it. And he said, and he made the motion of shoveling with his hands. He said, that's what you do. And I said, well, I know how to do that. I was raised as a blue-collar kid. I knew how to do manual labor. And sure enough, they said they had to raise $1 million to start this winery, and I think they had about half of it raised at the time I met them. And I thought, what are the chances of anybody giving these guys $1 million to start a winery? But we stayed in contact. We had a couple dinner parties over the months, and then like a month before the '79 harvest, he called me up and he said, "We're going. We've got the money. Show up in Kenwood in a week, and you got a job."
Okay, so. In Kenwood,
yeah.
at
the old St.
Francis.
At the old St. Francis,
right.
Yeah.
And St. Francis was St. Francis Winery then, or was
it was St. Francis.
It was St. Francis Winery.
Yeah. We made their wines off the estate, and we made Acacia's wine there. They didn't have a winemaker at that time, so part of the deal, custom crush was not much of a thing back then.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it took us another 2 years to actually build the Acacia Winery down in Carneros. So the 79-80 vintage were done at St. Francis, and then we.
And so, two questions: when you were at Davis, were you aware of the Vitinology program, and did you know some of those people? And then who were those people?
Well, that's really funny because when I first arrived there, the graduate school at that time was done in groups. So there's a plant physiology group, and there wasn't any department. And so I was housed in the pomology department, which is fruit science, and it's in the same. They shared the building with vit and enology, and I would see these guys, and I was dismissive of them because I thought they're just drinking wine all day. They're not scientists. What did I know? I was like, 22 years old. But then when I started making wine, I thought I've always had an academic bent. I love science, and I thought Davis is right there. It's a 45-minute drive from Napa, and I went to the food science department, and I said, I want to get a master's in enology. And they're like, why? You already have a master's, And I said, no, I want it in what I'm really interested in now. I said, and they thought it was the dumbest thing they'd ever heard, but they let me sign up. They took my money, and I took all the coursework. I would go up there like 1 or 2 days a week, obviously not in the fall because I was too busy with the winemaking, but in the spring and winter quarters. And I got all the coursework finished, and just as I was starting my dissertation, I had my son, and then that was, how it happens when you have a kid. All of a sudden, I was really busy. I thought I was busy before. So I never actually got. I did all the coursework for the masters and it was great. Like Roger Bolton was in charge of like the wine chemistry part of it then, and he was one of the most brilliant chemists I've ever. I mean, I'm a decent student, and I would just walk out of his lectures dizzy. They were that intense. It was like some of the most intense scholastics I've ever done. It was great.
Well, studying wine diseases too, that must be a really interesting aspect of it.
Yeah, but plant pathology is a. I was very interested. I only got into plant pathology because I was so interested in electron microscopy, and so I ended up in that department just because of my fascination with one particular instrument, with the electron
Which is
microscope.
say that again and tell us what that is.
Electron microscope is a microscope that can do incredibly high magnifications. It's hard to even I don't know how to describe it in layman's terms, but it's the most powerful visual tool.
Yeah.
For
it's like a telescope on the that you're looking at something in front of you.
It's like a space telescope, but you're looking at it in the Earth.
Right.
I mean, it's very difficult to prepare the samples. It's hard, very hard to operate. I was always fascinated with stuff like that. So that's how I ended up getting a degree in plant pathology. But actually, the plant physiology, which I studied as an undergraduate, and that I went to graduate school, that's where I thought I would continue to specialize in. That actually has some overlap with grape growing. I mean, that's kind of the language plants speak. They're not going to speak English, so you have to learn the language they're speaking. And the plant physiology is kind of how you can understand what a plant's up to.
Mm-hmm.
So you open Acacia.
Yeah.
Doing exactly what?
And
a lot of shoveling in the first couple of years.
Besides shoveling.
Driving tractors, doing all the lab work, tasting.
Chardonnay and Pinot only?
Chardonnay and Pinot only, yeah.
And the crazy thing is Chardonnay and Pinot only, and it was in Carneros.
Yes.
Because we certainly know Pinot was planted in all sorts of places it didn't belong.
That's correct.
But yet you guys picked a good spot.
Yeah, that was largely based on one vineyard, the St. Clair vineyard, which has been, Jim St. Clair died years ago and the vineyard got pulled out, so it doesn't exist anymore. But Mike Richmond, who was the founding winemaker at Acacia and taught me my craft, initially, he had tasted a Pinot Noir that ZD had made from that vineyard, and he was like, wow, this like really tastes like Burgundy. This doesn't taste like California Pinot. And then we bought from Winery Lake just because that has a brand name. And also, we were very interested in single vineyard wines at that time, and I still am. I still think that Pinot Noir is very appropriate as single Climat or Domaine type bottling. Mm-hmm. And at that time, Rene would give you a discount if you would put his vineyard on it. I mean, times have really changed now because he saw it as a way of promoting his vineyard.
Yeah,
he was a very clever guy. We became very good friends. Yeah, I used to be in and out of his house all the time, which was a wonderful house to hang out in.
We just had that conversation this morning with, I won't say who the property was, but I was talking to someone that said, "Oh yeah, if you want to put that vineyard on your label, you got to pay for it." And I was like, wait a minute, I thought they just tasted the wine and were like, okay, you're worthy. And they're like, no, you actually have to pay.
Well, I mean, you can pay in how much you pay for the grapes. Like if you want to put your name on it, it costs you times this.
This Bien Nacido, you have to send them a sample of the young wine, and they decide whether you can put the vineyard name.
Right.
And do you have any idea who's tasting it or who's
no comment? not a top
Who
wine
tastes all the Tokawan?
I don't know, John, but I'm sure there is a vetting process if you're getting Tokawan fruit. Number one is your bank account, and then number two is your bank account, and then number three is
your bank account. Okay,
I made 2 vintages of Tokawan when Providence was first starting, when Chalone was launching that. Andy and I go way back, and he gave me some Clone 6 off Tokawan, which I don't know if you know the Cabernet clones, but that's a real small clustered selection. Oh my God. I don't even like Cabernet. Really, I don't. I never drink it, but that was an amazing wine. And even back then, I think it was like 5,000 or 6,000 a ton. It was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And that was
I think
20
now
years ago.
Yeah, it's 20, 25, something like that at this point.
Providence was where it's located now. Was that the original location?
No, we made those first vintages at Acacia.
At Acacia.
Yeah.
And that was a Chalone.
Yeah, that was a Chalone project.
Was that the first like non-Chardonnay?
No,
because they had Carmenet.
They had Canoe Ridge. They had Carmenet. They had Canoe Ridge up in Washington State, which one of my John Abbott, who was probably the best student I ever had, or protege, or whatever the correct, He worked under me for a while, and he was and is a great winemaker. Yeah. He was so much fun to work with.
Wait, so what's that label? I've never heard of that label or had their wines before.
Which one?
That you're talking about that they were making at Acacia.
Provenance.
Provenance.
Yeah.
So Provenance is just before you come into St. Helena on the left-hand side. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a nondescript winery building. It's, for Napa, it's not anything to draw your attention other than being probably a well-designed winery. I think last I heard was the gentleman from Duckhorn.
I don't follow the business of wine very much.
Yeah. Cabernet.
But it's still a label?
Yeah. But now I think it's owned by, I believe now it's owned by one of the large conglomerates.
Okay.
So that's interesting that you don't follow that. It's good. Must be kind of freeing.
Well, I never really did. I mean, I was always interested in the vineyard and the wines,
right?
And I did management reluctantly, because if you do something well, they keep kicking you upstairs to manage other people doing it instead of letting you do it yourself. So I went through that process and then bounced out and started consulting, and that was a whole nother world, because with most consulting clients you offer advice but you're not executing it, so there's a level of distance, and one of the reasons I founded Campion in 2000 was so that I could have a hands-on project of my own and make exactly what I wanted, because it's wines, once they're at a certain quality, it's just stylistic differences, right? Mm-hmm. And the only way you can do it is to control every aspect of it. Work with a vineyard who lets you call all the vineyard management shots and do all the winemaking decisions yourself. And it has to be small scale to be able to do that. I've worked in lots of wineries at lots of different size levels, and I'm convinced that a single winemaker, as opposed to a team, you can only make about, let's say, 20 to 30,000 cases of wine if you want it at the highest quality. You get above that, somebody else is making some of the decisions. There's just too many barrels to taste.
Yeah.
I mean, even at 20 or 30,000, you've got a lot of barrels to taste.
That's
a lot of wine.
I thought he was going to say something like 5,000 when he said 20 or 30,000.
Right.
But then if you're not doing 20 different varietals.
Yeah. Well, for instance, at Tolosa, it was a successful tasting room, so there was 23 labels, 23 facings. Yeah. But I had 800 acres of vineyard to cherry pick the top 100 out of, which made my job so much easier, and a great staff. And so it just left me free to do the tasting. It was great.
Yeah, there's certainly, as you get bigger and you have more people, you, as a winemaker, you become farther and farther removed.
Right.
I can remember going from a cellar manager to an assistant winemaker and realizing what that was as I walked around with a clipboard more than I did,
dragging hoses,
and what was I actually happier doing, right? You like the promotion and the moving up, but really you want to drag hoses and be on top of a tank and, smell things and
topping barrels,
yeah.
Filling barrels. I love all that stuff. The actual daily routine of making wine.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's where, when I worked for the Benzigers, a lot of our cellar crew at the time it was the best of the best from the Glen Ellen days. Right?
Yeah.
But even those guys, there was still a processing part of it. Mm-hmm. They didn't drink wine. They didn't love wine.
Right.
And there's something lost with that. Whereas at Kenwood, the cellar crew, they were into wine, and they every night when we got done, we went down and tasted wine together, and there was discussions, and there was discussions pulling samples and tasting over barrels, and there's a loss of connection if you're not following it all the way through.
Yeah. No, that happens in restaurants a lot with cooks or chefs. Is that I've worked in a lot of restaurants where the people that are making the food have never gone out to a restaurant of the same quality that they are working at.
That's too bad.
And it's so I think they get a one-dimensional experience of like what they're doing. They think that they're just pumping out this food, but they've never seen the other side of it where people are actually appreciating what they're doing.
Right.
And so what a horrible feeling to just think that you're like running this production line, but then never getting to see the other side of it where people are, they're actually appreciating all this hard work that you do by all these little steps that you're taking with making each individual decision.
And I think that's the difference between a passion and a job.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's just a job.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it wasn't that these guys cared. I mean, they cared so much. They would do anything for those families to get the work done, right?
Yeah.
But there was a loss of connection for the nuance. And wine is nuance, right?
Yeah.
If you lose, you have opportunities to save things and change things. And when it's lost in that, you just end up following
protocol.
Right. So.
Yeah, I heard someone describe it once as it's a problem of scaling. That when you look at the world of wine, the very, very few top wines in terms of by scale, I mean a batch size. There's very few wines at the highest level where batch sizes are much above 3,000 or 4,000 cases. Something happens, the wheels start coming off. They don't lose quality, but it's as if they lose personality. They lose focus or something, and they just become more diffuse. It's like if it's like volume under curves, like the finest wines are like this, whereas bigger wines that are kind of like this. Right. There's plenty of flavor there. There's plenty of quality, but it just isn't. They aren't fun to talk to. They don't have any personality. Right. So, I think small batches are the way you have interesting wines.
Can I just the beginning?
Yeah, this wine is great, by the way. The Chardonnay is so good.
Well, first of all, this is when I was consulting. I was acting as the winemaker for the Smith family wines. Paraiso. Do you know those people down?
No.
They're one of the original planters in the Santa Lucia Highlands, and I've known them forever, for generations, literally 3 of their generations. And they were making wine at that time. They've ceased making wine. Now they're back to just grape growing. And they let me make my own wine while I was making theirs. And so I got to, again, cherry pick. They've got like 10,000 acres under grapes in Monterey, and they've got probably, I don't know, like 1,500 in Santa Lucia, a lot. And so it allowed me to cherry pick the vineyard sources. And, it was just, that was heaven. And 18 also was a great vintage for Pinot and Chardonnay because like the vintage we just had, like 23, there was no heat spells whatsoever. Right. I mean, it was cool throughout. And I think with Pinot and Chardonnay, heat, especially the kind of those August and September heat waves you can get, it just destroys the quality. Like the very best vintages are the cold vintages where there's no heat events.
We talk often on this when we talk about the 18s. We talk about how like you started picking things at the end of October, 1st November because you were running out of time.
Exactly.
But realistically, the weather was nice after it, and you could have let things hang even longer.
Yeah, but I don't. Hanging for its own sake is that's a tough
well, right. But but again, going back to your point, is like you weren't forced to pick anything.
No,
it was your decision when you were ready.
Yeah, exactly.
And rarely have we had that.
Well, with early ripening varieties like Chardonnay and Pinot, cold vintages are not as good for later. Like I made some Syrah and Cab this year, and it was a struggle to get the kind of flavor we wanted. Just because after about October 10th, the intensity of sunlight, the vines just aren't really metabolizing anymore.
Yeah, they're just hanging to hang.
Right.
Yeah.
There's just not enough force of photons or whatever hitting the leaves for them to really make flavor.
Yeah.
So,
Hey, Larry, with your vast years of doing this, what are some things that you see going on? And we'll just stick to production, because things that are going on in production that you're excited about, or maybe things that you see that you're shaking your head going, that's been done before. Why are they trying to do this again? Do you have any thoughts on that?
yeah, of course. In terms of, let's start with positive, because it's all too easy to focus on negative stuff. I think that the most interesting development to me personally has been the development of commercially available non-Saccharomyces yeast, starting with the Lafort's Alpha, and now there is Agide, which is a mixture of two different yeasts. The Alpha was a single yeast. That's transformed both red and white winemaking, as far as I'm concerned.
In what ways?
Because something goes on in that holding period pre-fermentation, before the fermentation begins, before the Saccharomyces, the true wine yeast, begin fermenting. And under most circumstances, that can be anywhere from 3 to 10 days, or maybe even 14 days before a fermentation takes off on ambient yeasts, which, there's Saccharomyces in this room with us. Probably not many, but there's some. And before the development of these selected non-Saccharomyces yeast, anything could happen during that period. And things did happen that were spoilage starts, basically. But also, if spoilage doesn't start, and especially with Chardonnay, a work I did with Jeff Myers at J. Lohr, when I was working with them, we found that if you have the same wine and they did experiments with like 50 barrel batches, really full scale experiments, the most amazing experimental work I've ever seen in Chardonnay. And if you take the same batch and you split it and you inoculate half that batch immediately, let's say with Montrachet, which I think is the best Chardonnay yeast for barrel fermentation, and then the other one you wait 10 days and then you inoculate it, the one where you had that 10 days of it just sitting as juice is far, far better than the one that you inoculate immediately. Something is going on in the juice that's positive. Nobody knows what it is, and it makes for a lot more complexity. And it's the whole thing about like uninoculated Chardonnays, which has been going on for a long, long time, makes better wine. But now with these selected non-Saccharomyces, you can put a holding yeast in there and you can get almost as long a period as you want, where it doesn't spoil, because these yeasts are ticking along at a tiny level. They call it bioprotection, but it's basically it's a little placeholder yeast that you're putting in there.
Right.
And they don't eat up the nutrients. They don't really consume much sugar. They like barely ferment. And then whenever you want, at 5 days or 10 days or whatever, you put in your whatever yeast you're going to use. Or you can also just let it go on its own. I mean, I like doing that too. Probably 20% of these wines, nothing went into the barrel except the juice, and just go on its own. There's some risk there, especially of sticking. I don't think I'd go 100% that way. I'm too conservative to do that. And in reds, you don't have to chill the must anymore to cold soak. What used to be called cold soak, you just put these yeast in and they hold it. Right. And not only that, but you get a much more, during that soaking period, you get a much more accurate analysis of your must. It used to be, that's a huge technical advantage.
I have a lot of Zinfandel this year that it's soaked up, and and I think it's still, it's well off skins. I know. But I feel like it's still soaking up. But yeah, that's interesting. I'm not a technical winemaker. I'm more of a seat of the pants, but holding yeast, it's really interesting because there is bad natural yeast out there.
Oh yeah. And bacteria too.
And I would probably say for myself, I've been lucky a whole bunch of times, and
your luck runs out eventually. Like, I've made enough wines that I've had every possible failure too, and I regret all of them. I've made wines that I've lost, and I still feel bad about it, and that was like more than 20 years ago. And the nice thing too, you can use less SO2 because you don't you can put these things in instead of SO2. You can use virtually zero SO2 at the destemming process. I mean, you eventually want to put some SO2 in there, I believe, but it definitely allows you to use a lot less SO2. So,
yeah, and the fact that the idea of cold soaking without
burning all that electricity up.
Burning all the electricity. Right. And just earlier when we were here with Scott, there was a pretty good discussion because, you know, Sam's family, they do this wine Auditet, which was a joint venture with Philippe Combi. Mm-hmm. And Philippe likes a long cold soak in the initial. And Scott was talking about, you know, cold soaking, you know, without the presence of alcohol, what you get out of it.
Oh, that's a technique I agree is a really good technique.
Yeah.
Especially for Pinot.
Right.
And that's what he tried to do. I remember when Adam Lee was here, he brought some of his wine club members one day, and I was talking about the Auditet wines and the extended soaking, and he said, oh yeah, when Philippe first approached me, he was talking about like 45 days or something, and he said, I thought he was fucking insane.
I had a valve on a jacket stick open in, when was that? It was 2003. It was with a Fire Peak Vineyard, Edna Valley Pinot Noir, and nobody caught it. And I was working out of Napa still at that time, so I was only, you know, it was in the cold soak period. I was like, well, when it starts fermenting, I'll come down and see what's going on. So I was like all over the place back then. I won't do that anymore. I like stay in one place during harvest now. But during that period, I was like making wine all up and down the state. It was a mess. But anyways, this thing stuck open. And so it ended up, and to warm it back up after it got down to like 32 degrees, because it was like full on for like days and days before anybody caught it. And it ended up being like a 21-day cold soak before it started fermenting. And that was an amazing wine.
Yeah.
I wouldn't repeat it,
right.
But it really was good. Right. Plus, no winery would let you, in their right mind, would let you burn that much electricity for it. So
and what's the downside of having the skin soak that long? Isn't it that you're kind of worried about tannin, right? Because you've got...
Depends on the grape variety.
And also, in an aqueous solution without alcohol, you're not going to extract very much tannin. And in Pinot in particular, all the tannin is in the seeds. There's none in the skin. Okay. So until you get at the seed and break down the layer around it, which usually takes alcohol to do that, in my experience.
Because that's the whole point, is getting the extraction before alcohol is present.
Right. That was Philippe's whole thing, is that he wanted the extraction before alcohol.
But I think like letting this Chardonnay juice sit before it starts fermenting, there's some kind of passive chemical stuff going on when juice just sits. And I don't know what it is, but it makes for more flavorful wine. So it's not just about extract and when and how you extract. Right. It's about when that juice is just sitting there as juice, there's some passive chemical things going on that make for better flavors.
And it's interesting because you have to, if you blindly put juice into barrels and you say, you know, it'll start on its own, you have to get used to that. Like you go and you smell your barrels every day or a couple times a day, and you have to get used to that pungentness and go, it's not really good. I hope it's better tomorrow. And you go back tomorrow and all of a sudden you go, I got CO2, I'm good, right? And you get this false sense of security. But something was happening in between there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But everyone talks, you know, the over the last 10 years, it's all been, wild yeast, we're not inoculating. But then people that generally run more financially backed consumer wineries will say they'll inoculate because they want tried and true. We know it's going to start at this time. We know it's going to be finished at this time. There's no worry involved.
I'm very comfortable uninoculated whites, and I think especially with the aromatic whites. Like when I was at Claiborne and Churchill recently, last 4 or 5 years, I recently left there. They make a lot of Gewürztraminer and Riesling, and oh my God, wouldn't use any selected yeast on that. I'd let them all go wild because it makes such a profound difference. In Chardonnay, the difference is there, but it's more subtle. But in the more aromatic the wine, the more important role yeast plays. And uninoculated, and it's Saccharomyces, some form of Saccharomyces is doing that ferment. So the whole idea of wild versus it's specific to the wine. Like on reds, I always add a selected yeast. It's just far too much risk as far as I'm concerned, for me to have.
And when you say risk, you mean
spoilage, lack of production of sufficient alcohol, absolute spoilage, all kinds of problems. Off flavors, formation of chemicals that'll give you headaches. I 100% I use selected bacteria. Like all those biogenic amines that cause most of the allergic reactions in wine are caused by uninoculated ML, unselected ML.
You're just, our listeners' minds are just being blown now.
Well, and
everybody's trying to figure out where the headaches come from.
It's absolutely, it's the biogenic amines. It's like histamine. Anyone will get an allergic reaction from it. And the research indicates that those are produced almost exclusively by bacteria, and the selected bacteria don't produce any of them. And that's why if you want to make healthful wines, you should be inoculating heavily with selected bacteria and not letting it go wild.
And when you say bacteria, you mean?
ML bacteria.
ML bacteria strictly.
Yeah. And also they've been selected now so they don't produce any diacetyl. Diacetyl's nasty. I mean, that'll give you a headache too.
Well, and that's also something that I think people don't understand, and that's a generational thing. Like everybody hears about like big fat buttery Chardonnays, and they don't realize that the ML of the time, that's exactly what it was supposed to do, was produce diacetyl.
Right.
And now it's different.
Yeah. Diacetyl is not, if you added diacetyl to your wine, you would think it ruined it, and it pretty much would ruin it. I mean, and it accelerates oxidation and aging. It's really not something you want at all.
And the only common consumer response to that is it's sulfites.
Yeah.
That's what causes the headache.
No, it doesn't actually. Yeah, it's not. There's a lot of misinformation. People have a limited appetite for scientific and technical information, but there's a lot of good information and a lot of good work that's been done in wine science, beginning with Louis Pasteur. So, and it's been a subject of scientific investigation as a comestible product longer and more intensively than anything else.
Was Pasteur a winemaker?
No, he was a scientist.
I know that, but I thought he might.
He might have described himself. I don't know. In modern parlance, he'd probably be called a bacteriologist or a microbiologist or something.
So that's a great one. I had no idea where you were going with that, but that's a great positive thing going on in the business. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and techniques keep being improved. I mean, the development of cross-flow filtration for wine was, I think, one of the best things ever. These Diam corks, even though they've been around 20 years now, are one of the best technical improvements of my lifetime as a winemaker. I would have killed for a closure like that one. I had to use natural corks, which suck. I mean, they're just the worst. Besides contaminating wine with flavor, they're unpredictable in their oxygen transfer. So any given bottle could have like 10 times more oxygen transferring through the cork, where you get, the best kind of technical closures, and they all transfer exactly the same amount of oxygen. It's great. And they're a little cheaper than natural corks too.
Yeah.
So. It's amazing. You hear these arguments or discussions or philosophies, and it's pretty compelling, right? Like, we've had cork people on, and
well, I work for a cork person who is adamant that natural cork is the way to go, but traditional thinking, and they've gotten the numbers down, around 1%, whereas it used to be 8 to 10% or whatever it was. But
I've had batches in my career that were closer to 20. I mean, there's some really bad. Anyone who worked with natural cork has had, but even if that problem aside, the difference in permeability from cork to cork, there's no way around that.
Just because the fact that it's a natural product and it's unreliable.
It's a different part of the tree. Each one is.
Right, exactly.
Grain.
It's like Peter Moldar when he talks about Hungarian oak being different biologically than French oak. And
it's got different flavors for sure.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. Really
it's just
different.
A tighter molecular structure, I believe.
It smells a lot like clove to me, Hungarian oak versus French. That's what I get when I've played with it.
You're using mostly French?
Yeah, like French oak.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and 3 year stave aged, really important.
Okay, I was going to say, how deep do you go? Are you looking for a particular forest and it's a certain...
Medium to tight grain. I think grain selection is probably I'm not crazy for one forest the other, but I think the producer, the cooper, is very, very important, and how they age and how they make the barrels.
Where does that all come from in France?
The forests are all over central France mostly. They stretch from just south of Paris down through the center of France. France has the highest percentage forested acre of any country in the world, I think.
And the coopers have gone away from calling forest selected. It's really gone
More
to
by grain type. Yeah.
And tighter grained, less impactful.
Yeah.
The cognac makers and the distilled spirits people, like the very open grain, make big impact.
And if you had a big wine that you wanted to mature more quickly, you might select some open grain oak, get a little more oxygen into it. But it'd be more effective to just rack it a couple extra times.
Right.
This is such a rabbit hole. I mean, you just keep on going.
You have no
deeper
idea. When
and
it comes to barrels, you can have 5 shows on barrels and have completely different opinions from every single person involved as far as...
And I've worked at wineries with budgets and size enough to be able to test a lot of barrels, and you find what you like and you find what works with the given wine, but it has to be at least probably a 5 or 6 barrel lot, because as you taste, as you know, as winemakers, you taste barrel to barrel from the same cooper to the same barrel. There's differences.
Yeah,
it's a natural product.
Yeah, I was just going to say the fact that
handcrafted product.
What you said about 50 barrel lot. I mean that's an awesome study if you can do that. That's a comparison.
And very few wineries can do that, or have the wherewithal to even run.
Yeah.
Well, and it takes so long.
Someone to take care of, make sure it doesn't get ruined, right? It's so many times it's like, I just stick them together, and you go, but I was monitoring those.
That it has to start from the top. The winemaker has to be very interested in that.
But yes, there's a huge difference. Not a huge difference. There's differences from barrel to barrel, without a doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a matter of, they used to joke about, you never wanted a Cadillac that was finished on a Friday, or maybe it was a Monday. I mean, the same thing. Could you imagine a guy standing over a fire toasting a barrel and he's hung over from too much mezcal the night before?
That happens to be the barrel.
That happens to be your barrel.
Yeah.
Right?
We had a little mezcal tasting last night after dinner.
Wait, at home or
at my son's place in Napa? Yeah.
Wait, so tell me the results. What?
It wasn't anything formal. He just opened He had 5 different bottles going, and we just tasted them and picked the ones we liked.
And did you have a favorite?
It's on my phone. I could probably. I don't know mezcal. It's not something I studied. So.
Oh yeah, no, we've done a little studying around here.
So you're up for you're a cyclist.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
And you're up for a race.
Yeah, it's an outlaw race.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a you're not pinning a number on. Real races you pin numbers on and you have to pay.
Right. And how long have you been a rider?
This was my favorite. I started commuting to college. Well, I've rode my whole life, but I started taking bicycling seriously. I was commuting to college. I put myself through college, so I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together.
Yeah.
And a bike was the cheapest way to get there. And then a couple of guys that were in the art department with me had racing bikes. This was in like late 60s. And one of them was a Cinelli and the other was a Paramount. And they were so beautiful. And aesthetically, I wanted it because it was such a beautiful machine.
Right.
So I saved and saved and saved. And eventually I bought a high-end Raleigh road bike.
Okay.
I went to Davis for graduate school. It's a big bike town.
Bike,
started getting into long-distance cycling. Started doing like ultra-endurance type events. And then in my mid-30s, discovered road racing, started road racing. And then mountain bike racing with my son. My son's a cyclocross racer. That's what he really likes these days.
Wait, what is that?
It's when you basically race on the dirt on a road bike. It's really cool. And you have to leap up stairs and shit. It's crazy.
Oh, I've seen that. Okay.
Yeah. And then I did some mountain bike racing. I've recently been doing some track racing.
Wow.
Yeah, I still road race, and I race on the track and some gravel racing.
And you're down the Central Coast.
In San Luis Obispo.
Gravel race or gravel riding mecca down there.
It's fantastic.
You only have to go about 2 blocks off a road and you're on dirt.
I know. There's especially like just north of me and like around Santa Margarita and Pozo, endless dirt roads. It's fantastic. It's really. I spend most of my time on a gravel bike these days because it's like road riding but no cars.
Right.
You know.
And what do you ride?
I've got a custom Inglis.
Okay.
It was actually a birthday present for my son for my 68th birthday. One of the nicest presents I've ever
I was going to say, you taught your son well.
Exactly. Well, I bought him a lot of bikes over the years, too, because when I told him it was too generous, he was like, shut up, Dad. How many bikes did you buy me over the years?
That's awesome.
So, yeah, it was great. Yeah, I love cycling. I'm a good athlete in that I devote a lot of time to it, and I'm stubborn and I understand training, but I'm not genetically gifted. So, you know, when I was a younger athlete, my goal was always, if I could get into the top 10, I was doing really, really well. But now as I've gotten older and there's fewer and fewer people, it's age category racing. Right. Now I'm on the podium all the time because all my competition has died or injured out. And I started racing in NorCal in 1985. And I always wanted a district championship. And this year I finally got a district championship, a state championship, essentially. Actually 2, one for the 2,000 meter pursuit on the track and the road time trial. I won the gold medal this year after 40 years of trying.
Wow, congrats.
And that whole market started with Schwinn way back when in the United States.
Yeah. Yep.
I remember having a Motobacan or a Gitane just because those are so cool.
I've got an old Gitane track bike still that was probably built in like 1959 or something. It's really cool.
Yeah. I was a cross country runner, and I was again not I didn't have the body for being the cross country runner, but I could do it because I had great endurance.
Right.
And I did okay. And so obviously running went away, but one thing I've always been able to do is ride. And I did my first century like in high school, and it's something that I can continue to do. And I've come accustomed to sometimes being one of the last guys in, because it's not about that. It's about the challenge and just finishing it yourself.
Yeah, like this group I'll ride with tomorrow, most of them will be half my age, and I'll be one of the slowest guys out there, but I'll be able to finish it and I'll have a lot of fun.
And you're supporting a charity also.
I'm doing I do a
Chef Cycle
called Chef Cycle.
Oh, great!
And so that's coming up. But
that's fantastic.
But the riding allows me to eat cheese and drink beer.
that's why I get on the bike a lot too, because then I don't have to hold back at the table.
Right. Awesome.
Did we talk about this? We didn't.
We didn't talk about the Biendecito much.
Yeah.
This is from Block L. Biendecito is a big vineyard. Block L is it's Robert Young's selection, so it's an old California selection. This is on a split trellis, which is quite unusual. But actually, I kind of like split trellises. I planted a couple split trellis vineyards when I was at Acacia.
Will you explain that just for people that don't work out in the vineyard?
Yeah. Most are single trellis. That is, you have posts and wires, and the shoots grow up from the vine straight into a single panel of leaves and a single line of fruit. And a split trellis, you split the vine, and in each vine is 2 panels. So it effectively doubles the density of vine canopy, fruit zone per acre. Yeah. So you can take a less crop per shoot. It turns out that in the physiology of the vine doesn't transfer between shoots very much. The leaves that are on the shoot that the cluster is on, that's what they get. There's very little transferring between shoots. So with a split trellis, you can have 1 cluster per shoot instead of the normal 2 to 3. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very expensive to put in. It's very the more panels of fruit and leaves you have to manage, the more labor. And it's also the infrastructure of all those posts and wires is much more expensive. Mm-hmm. But this particular block is a split trellis, and because it's not vertically trapped, it's draped, and so all this fruit is shade grown, which is why I particularly like this block. It sees just the most dappled sunlight, and its drapes open so that the air circulation gets in there. It stays pretty clean most of the time in terms of disease. And this was stainless fermented. There were 8 barrels and only 1 new oak barrel and 1 used oak barrel, and all the rest were stainless barrels. About a quarter of it uninoculated. The new oak, I always use Montrachet. I think nothing works better with a new oak barrel than Montrachet yeast. It was I think, if I'm correct, it's the first selected yeast. The Pasteur Institute in Paris selected that yeast. It's UC Davis 522 is its name in this country, but most winemakers call it Montrachet or M.
It has a very distinctive. It's very distinctive aromatically and texturally. Correct?
It's also, it has high nutrient demands, and if your must or your juice is not naturally rich in nutrients, it's going to stink. It's going to have problems. So you got to really watch your nutrient level when you're using that yeast. But if you can tune your nutrient level, it makes fantastic wine.
This is really elegant.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Very low alcohol, both of these. This even lower. I think this is like,
it's like 13.
maybe 12.5 or 12.6, something like that.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
And so you're continuing to make wine, obviously.
I just sold this project. This was my own little pet project. At like $100,000 worth of inventory. It generated a little 20 or 30 grand in income a year.
Just Chardonnay?
Just Pinot Noir usually. These were, there were no Chardonnays made in between this, but it was Pinot made every year. But I think I drink mostly Pinot, but Chardonnay fascinates me. So Chardonnay is fun to talk about. It's more intellectual than Pinot.
And so when you say you sold this, so this was a brand that you created, but then you sold it to someone else who's continuing to make the wines under this label.
I'm continuing as the winemaker, but he's the owner now.
Gotcha. So now you just spend your time making the wine and don't worry about any of the other bullshit.
But I'm sure you keep on top of every little thing.
Well, the new owner doesn't know how to make wine. He just loves wine. And he's got some money, and that's very common in the business.
Who's doing vineyard management?
These are Bien Nacido they manage their own vines, but you get to tell them what you want. I mean, that's the best vineyards will allow you basically to make the management calls.
Yeah,
we'll
Bien
work with
Nacido
you.
has an incredible vineyard management team. I think Chris is still. I don't know if he's still there.
I don't know if Chris.
Yes,
is still.
he's still there.
Okay,
yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, one of the premier vineyards in California.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think you can say that very safely.
And also the
size of it.
And also the whole Santa Maria Valley is fantastic Chardonnay appellation. I think one of the very best in California.
Yeah.
Can I talk about my book a little bit?
Of course.
Yeah, that was the whole point. Sorry.
We just get distracted with the other stuff.
Yeah. No, I do too. So anyways, I wrote this book after I left Tolosa in 2015. I had a year's severance, and my wife had been bugging me to write a book, and so I started writing it. And every morning I spent 4 hours writing, and in about 6 months it was done. And I wanted to write it in 3 sections: tasting, wine flavor and tasting, then wine growing, and then wine making. I finished it, and a good friend of mine who's works as an editor asked her to read it. And I sent her a chapter, I don't remember, I sent her part of it. And then she was visiting me a couple of weeks later, and she just laughed at me. She said, "Larry, the only reader for this book is you." Because I love really dense language and complex grammar, and so I'd written this like really, really dense book. Mm-hmm. And I said, "But I love this kind of prose," and she says, "Nobody else does."
Right.
And she said, "You don't have to dumb it down, but you have to simplify it." And I said, "Well, I don't know what you mean." She said, "Well, we'll go." We went back to my desk, and the preface, which is the shortest part, it's about 4,000 words. She said, "We'll just go through this, and I'll go through it with you sentence by sentence and tell you what you have to change to make this readable to an ordinary human." And she went over it with me, and she said, now rewrite this and send it to me, and we'll see if you've, listening to what I'm telling you about it. So I rewrote it. It took me, 10 or 12 hours just to rewrite that 4 or 5 pages. It was really arduous. It had to be completely changed. And I sent it to her, and she said, perfect. This is what, now you have to do you have to read that, right? The whole rest of the book like this. And I said to her, but I don't even like the way it reads anymore. I don't recognize my voice in it, and I hate it now. And she said, all authors tell me that. She said that's very common. She said, now just get to work if you want to. And so by that time I was working again. The severance had used up that money. It was time to get back to work. So I didn't have 4 hours every morning to work on it. So it took me, over the course of about 4 or 5 years, I went through several drafts of it. And about 2 years ago, I hired a gal who's worked on some websites for me, and a professional copy editor. I spent about another $1,000, and I put together a publisher's pack, which was a perfectly copy edited chapter and blah, blah, all this stuff that you have to do for publishers. Send it out. A couple of publishers. It got bounced around a little bit. 2 or 3 publishers were interested in it. I settled on one, and then they said, okay, here's now what you have to do. And I realized I'm going to have to go out and sell it just like I used to have to sell wine, which I hate. And I was just like, I'm not doing that. I had a lot of fun writing this. It's done. It's accomplished. It's in finished form. And I just shelved it. That was about 1.5 years ago. And, but it was bugging me that I'd put so much work into it. I mean, literally years of work. And it was, in some sense, I felt like my legacy, like everything I've learned in 4 decades of winemaking is in that book. And then I was reading all these essays on Substack, and I'd done a little publishing in magazines, and I'd published some stuff in Medium. I don't know if you guys follow that world of, kind of online publishing, but I'd published some essays there on various subjects. And then more and more I kept being drawn to Substack. So a lot of the writers that I respect, like George Saunders, you guys, you know who he is, Lincoln and the Bardo, fantastic book, wonderful writer. He started publishing on Substack, and I thought, I can just post this up on Substack, and it can exist, and it'll find what readers it finds. So about I was going to do it in December, and my wife said, no, everybody's busy in December. She said, start it in January. So I got it all set up, and first week in January started putting it out there.
So for those of you out there, tell them it's called Liquid Geography.
Right. Yeah.
Tell them how they can find it. I signed up for the mailing list.
Right.
Haven't really kind of gotten into. I've received a couple things, but please tell everybody.
Yeah, the way Substack works is you can. I've got it set up so you can sign up free because I wanted it open source. You can also pay me, which I would appreciate. They have both a paid and unpaid subscriptions. Right now, it's 100% free if you want. What's curious is about 10 or 15% of the people are paying, even though they don't have to, which is nice. But you just go to Substack and search it, and Substack will also allow you to read a few things for a little while for free that are normally paid to try and induce you. But you can just sign up as a free subscriber to it or as a paid subscriber. So you just get on your computer and type in Substack Liquid Geography, and you'll end up there.
And who do you envision reading this? Who do you want or hope that is reading it?
You know what? I think it's aimed at wine professionals.
Yeah.
It would be it's not a textbook.
Right.
And it's not a manual either. They're not recipes, but there's a huge amount of practical information in it. So someone early in their career or a student of wine, I think somms and wine writers and anyone
studying for their MW or anything like that.
Yeah, it basically, even though it's aimed at professionals, I think anyone who's passionately interested in wine, it's written in plain English, jargon free.
Yeah.
You don't need a degree in any kind of science to understand that there's literally no technical language in it whatsoever.
After you didn't dumb it down. You made it easier to read.
Well, I was always in jargon-free it was not written as a scientific book because there's plenty of wine science books out there. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write a book on the craft of wine. So that's what it is.
Excuse me. So now with the sort of the evolution of the industry where you don't have to own a big castle with a long driveway with vineyards, and people can make wine at crush pad facilities and don't necessarily have to have gone to Fresno or Davis.
Right.
So that's what I was kind of thinking, more people like that have an interest in making wine but don't have an interest in going to school.
Garage East.
Right. Where that might have valuable information in there where they...
Oh, for sure. Like, I mean, again, someone that's in the early stages of their investigation of wine, especially if they're interested in growing it or making it, I think they would find this book very interesting. Yeah. There's real deep dives on every aspect of winemaking, but in no way could you just pick this up solo and do it. You would still need other resources. Right. I mean, winemaking's like
not a how-to book.
Winemaking's like cooking. You have to teach yourself ultimately. I mean, that's how the only way you learn to make wine is making wine. Yeah. So, but it's fun to read about it too. I mean, I love reading, so it's fun. It was fun for me to write about it.
Because I mean, how many harvests have you done?
44 in California. A couple in Argentina and one in New Zealand.
I mean, he's in the top 3, right? We had, I think, Ramey was
Arrowwood,
Ren Harris.
Ren was up
65.
No. Well,
Ren. I mean, no shade on Ren. Ren wasn't in the cellar. Like Ren was in the business.
He's not a hands-on wine.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, and that's a little different. This is different. You know.
Right. And Richard from Arrowwood. Yeah.
You know, Charlie Tolbrook. You know. So yeah.
Steve Kistler's had a bazillion.
Sure. We're only talking about people we've had on the show.
Okay. Right. And also Steve was the first guy in California to use this technique of aging through into the next year.
Right.
He was doing that before anybody was.
That's fascinating. It really is.
Yeah.
Do you think that he does that with all those wines?
I'm pretty sure he does. I mean, we used to be in the same technical group together years ago, but I haven't seen him in a long time. So I don't know what he's up to these days. But I remember when he was first describing that technique to me, and I was thinking, I did. It was before I. Did
you kind of roll your eyes about it?
Of course, like whenever you hear anything new, that's what you always. I have to tell you a funny story about this vintage. So there's a new owner. I'm working for this guy now. I'm in this essence his consulting winemaker, not an employee, and we're making. We decided what we were making. We're making Pinot Noir. We're making Chardonnay. We got some Grenache and Syrah from down at San Ynez because he wants to broaden the portfolio of wines he's making. And the harvest is rolling along. The Pinot's in. Chardonnay's coming in. He says, I've got some Mourvedre. It's going to come in a couple of days. And I was like, what? I was like, what do you mean it's going to come in for a couple of days? What do you mean Mourvedre? And I was like, I haven't even seen the vineyard, right? And I'm like, what? What have I got myself into? And
once contract fell through.
And then he tells me it's 6,000 a ton. And I'm like, what?
Oh God!
And it's like, first of all, like I don't drink Mourvedre. I don't think very highly of it as a varietal. And I'm thinking, oh God, the things you do for money. And so then I say, let's go look at the vines, okay? Before you sign a contract or before this fruit comes in, I need to see the vines. And so it's a Ducey vineyard. It's called Paper Street. It's up on a hilltop in the west side of Paso, up in the hills. And it's a cool-looking vineyard, and Matt Ducey, who shows it to us, I figure out that I know him, and we have mutual friends. It turns into like a really nice afternoon. We go and taste the wine that they make it. They make it from that same block at their own winery, and make it as a single varietal, which is unusual for Mourvedre. Yeah. I taste it. It's delicious. I'm like, okay. So maybe this isn't such a bad thing. But I've never made a Mourvedre in my life. I go to all the books in my library because I got like hundreds of wine books at home. And I start reading everything I can, doing like the world's fastest study on Mourvedre. I call a couple people I know. They're all like, Mourvedre? Are you kidding? And everybody's like giving me a hard time.
I mean, I got 2 days. You got to help me out here.
Listen, and I think we know that all of his friends are all Pinot and Chard guys.
Yeah, many of them, but I've got a wider group of winemaking friends than that. Anyways, long story short, it ends up making like probably one of the very best wines I've ever made in my career. It is just mind-blowingly delicious. It's like insanely aromatic. Not that usual dog meat, that Mourvedre can do. Instead, it's like perfumed and floral and intensely fruity. It's black as ink, but it's not tannic. It's and it's an amazing wine. It was just a little lesson in just bite your tongue, do your job. You don't know what's going to happen until you make the wine,
And is that wine available now?
Oh, it won't even be bottled for probably another 18 months, and probably it'll be available in about 3 years. You can come down to the winery and taste it if you want.
Great.
It's in a giant 450-liter punch, and
because this has got to be right by. I mean, we went down to Vicky Carroll's house, right? So she's sort of in this area.
Well, Vicky's in Vicky's south, closer to San Luis Obispo.
Okay.
Ducey's just south of. It's right off of 46, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So right outside, just
south of Paso in the hills.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I assume you're not a social media guy.
A little bit. My wife's really good at it.
Okay. So do you want to give a shout out for our listeners? Might want to find you on social media, and then one more time for the website.
Yeah.
Yeah. The book, Liquid Geography, on Substack.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm actually on Instagram as a voluptuary.
Okay.
But that's mostly like pictures of bicycles and things like that. There's not much wine stuff on my Instagram.
We'll add it to the notes, and then shout out the wines that you want to shout out that you might be working on.
Yeah, the Campion wines. I'm continuing to work on, and I work on other miscellaneous projects too. But this is the only branded project I'm working right now.
Yeah, and we'll put it in the show notes, and hopefully some of our listeners will say hi and check out the book. And
that would be great.
Wines.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks, Larry.
Oh, thank
Much
you.
appreciated.
Yeah, the wines are great.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely.
Glad you guys
I
enjoyed
really,
them.
truly enjoyed, especially doing the A/B test. It was just, well, I mean, I like that.
Yeah.
I that's really the only way I can appreciate one versus the other, and I appreciated them both.
Well, that's what our brains are good at, actually, is that compare and contrast.
It's funny. We were doing that here in the tasting room where we had the whole Auditet thing was a study in terroir. So it was what would happen if you took the same grape, same clonal selection, same growers, same winemaker, same exact process, but from two different vineyards. And so we used to pour them side by side. And the problem was that we found out people, they wanted to pick a winner and a loser.
Yep.
It wasn't that they could appreciate them both and appreciate the differences. They wanted to know which one they liked more than the other one. And so we stopped doing that.
Well, I appreciated both of these.
No, I like
That's
that
the
you
idea.
said that. That was important. When you said that, I went, oh, okay, that's kind of cool.
There's a reason that computers have digital logic, because that's kind of the way our brains, the human brain is that way a lot.
Yeah.
Well,
we like yes/no things.
And during all the time we've been doing this podcast, there are no doubt that we say things. We'll say something, John will go, "What? Can you explain that?" Or John will ask a question, and I'll roll my eyes and go, "Come on, John, you don't know that." But the fact is John's a consumer, right? And
he's never made a wine. He's never worked in a tasting room. Yeah.
And the same thing, we have to use it to something technical. You got to explain it.
I've been to plenty of tasting rooms.
Right.
I've never worked in one. All right.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Larry. Much appreciated.
Yeah. Drink
All right.
more Chardonnay.
And we will talk to you guys next week. Thanks so much.
Awesome.
You guys want to keep these